When the prosecuting attorney in St. Louis County, Robert McCullough, finally announced on Monday evening that there would be no indictment against Officer Darren Wilson in the shooting death of Michael Brown, there was a predictable outburst of looting and burning on the part of what must be said was just a small minority of those who had been involved in the demonstrations there in Ferguson since the shooting of Michael Brown in the middle of August. There have been people who've been devoted to being present and regularly demonstrating without any incident of violence, and many of whom actually stepped up to defend stores and shops from looting. But there were incidents of shootings and of burning and violence. Tuesday morning, the Ferguson police chief, Tom Jackson, was angry that the clergy had not shown up to do more to prevent this violence. And you know, I've often complained quite loudly and publicly about clergy not showing up, clergy not getting outside their churches and showing up in public incidents to bear prophetic testimony when they need to take a stand. But I've not driven to St. Louis. I've not participated in any of these demonstrations, and I sure wasn't there Monday night, and I could have been. In part, I have stayed away because I don't feel like it's up to the clergy to try to protect the city of Ferguson or the police department in Ferguson from the natural consequences of their racially motivated public policies. It's not up to us to stop the public from reacting to the injustices that they have experienced for generations. Now, I don't agree with those who set fire to buildings in Ferguson. I don't agree with looting when you're angry about a social event. I don't want in any way to act like it's okay that people brought guns to those demonstrations and were shooting, even if they were just shooting in the air or throwing stones or batteries at policemen. I don't agree with that, but I understand. I understand how it can happen. And I want for you to know, if you've not heard it in the news already, that it wasn't just black protesters who were setting fires to buildings and shops. Michael Brown's family were members of a church in Ferguson, Flood Christian Church, and white supremacists burned that church to the ground on Monday night. And I have not heard that mentioned on CNN or MSNBC. I would never hear anything on Fox, but I'm relatively certain it hasn't been on Fox. And that church had received over 70 death threats of the pastor to the pastor of that church and threats of violence against that church building, and it was burned to the ground Monday night. Our corporate media keeps an audience by making white people feel superior to and somewhat afraid of black people. They appear to have no incentive to even report on white crime against the black community. It just never rises to the point of being mentioned. A liquor store being burned by blacks is newsworthy. A church being burned by whites is not. And you cannot then say that the corporate media is not racially motivated in how they decide what goes on TV and what doesn't. But still, I didn't go. And I'm not going now because I'm not comfortable with what I perceive as a push to portray Michael Brown as a martyr that represents the plight of young black men in America. And I don't think that Officer Wilson is the incarnation of evil that we want to put up as the image of the representation of racism that we want to fight. Still, saying that, I understand anyone that feels differently. I understand that Michael Brown's family does want to put him up as a representative of what happens to young black men, and I understand that they want to make Darren Wilson an example of racism. But Michael Brown was a kid who evidently did use his size and strength to intimidate others and to push the boundaries. If he did what he was accused of, and there's so many different accounts that I'm not comfortable at all in saying what happened. But if he did push a policeman back into his car and hit him in the face and try to get his gun, then I don't want to make that person the martyr who represents black young men. Similarly, we were horrified this week by the news of a 12-year-old boy, Tamir Rice, who was shot and killed by Cleveland police. Again, the boy was technically unarmed, but he had a real-looking BB gun, and he was pointing it at people in a city park, trying to frighten them. And so if you're trying to frighten people, you can't be surprised when people are frightened, and that the reaction to it ended up with him being killed. Now, he shouldn't have been killed. Tamir Rice should not have been killed. The police should have managed that situation infinitely better. And this one is actually on videotape, and apparently the police shot Tamir Rice 2 seconds after they arrived on the scene. So there was no real effort to manage the situation. Tamir needed a good talking to. I mean, that kid shouldn't have been out in a public place trying to scare people, making them think he had a gun. He needed a really good talking to. He didn't need a good shooting. Now, as long as you can legally buy a BB gun at Walmart, and I would argue maybe you shouldn't be able to. I don't think they should make toy guns that look like real guns. I think we should stop doing that. But if we're going to do it, and it's legal to buy it, then you shouldn't get shot by the police for having one. There were, however, many things in the Ferguson case, in Officer Wilson's testimony and subsequent interviews, that I find to be very disturbing. That he said that Michael Brown looked demonic. That just buys into this whole stereotype of white fear of specifically big black men. The notion of a large black man offering a larger threat. I weigh way too much and I'm 6'2", but I don't think a policeman should roll up and shoot me just because of my size. Maybe keep me from ordering cashew chicken, but not shoot me. It is a definitive difference when a policeman, and Darren Wilson is himself 6'4", and for him to simply describe Michael Brown as looking demonic, that's horrifying to me. And the officer fired his weapon 12 times. And he hit Michael Brown 6 times. And it's quite possible that he killed him when he was more than 100 feet away from him, farther away than the outside wall of this building. And so you can say that you're terrified, and he probably was. If he'd been hit in the face, if he'd had a guy trying to fight him for his gun, but really you have to shoot someone 6 times when they are that far away from you? And again, I don't want to make Darren Wilson sound like he's the representative of evil. He had evidently never drawn his gun before in his police life. He was not known as being a racist. He was not known for being excessively aggressive. I can name 5 policemen right here in Springfield right off the top of my head that I would say are racist and are aggressive. This guy evidently wasn't. But when asked if there was anything that he could have done differently, he said no. And he didn't even manage to say that he wished that Michael Brown hadn't died. Now, shooting handguns, it's been 40 years since I've fired a gun, but handguns are notoriously difficult to aim at a distance. And so you might say that you were shooting at a person, and you know the notion that you could wound someone at 100 feet away rather than kill them. That might be stretching it. But you could at least say, I wish that I'd been able to stop him without killing him. I wish that he wasn't dead. But what he did say is he couldn't have done anything other than use lethal force. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is not true. I don't think that Wilson was likely a monster, but that he did not get an indictment, that he wasn't able to say that he wished that he had managed the situation differently, then I got to say I understand the riots in Ferguson. I understand. But in this same week, decades-old charges of rape against a seemingly charming and lovable comedian, Bill Cosby, seem to have come now in such large numbers. I think the count is up to 16 women who are alleging rape. It's now impossible to ignore them. So a new TV show featuring Bill Cosby has been canceled. Even his appearances in Las Vegas have been canceled, and you got to know that the expectations of the moral fiber of performers in Las Vegas is not known for being all that high. But even if Bill Cosby is only guilty of 10% of the charges against him, his career is over. But 6 years ago, when President Obama was first elected, people were saying that it was possible to elect a black president in large part due to the popularity of Bill Cosby and Oprah Winfrey. That Bill Cosby and Oprah Winfrey had opened the minds of white voters to the possibility of electing a black president. Now here's the paradox that we as moral thinkers, and why is there a church if we're not here to do moral deliberation? If we're not here to do critical thinking about ethics, why are there still churches? So here's the paradox that we have to think about, that we have to deal with as mature, intelligent adults. Bill Cosby, as a single individual, his sex crimes are horrible, and he is one of the most important transformative figures in race relations in America. Both are true. Both are true. Thomas Jefferson, John Kennedy, Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., even Dorothy Day, even sweet Dorothy Day, have some horrible things in their past, some things to be ashamed of in their personal lives. So yeah, it's important for us to be able to say Michael Brown wasn't a saint, but you don't have to be a saint to not be shot by the police. In many ways, in spite of how they died, it's almost fortunate that Gandhi and Kennedy and King got to leave the stage of public attention before their personal lives became fodder for media taunting. No one can stand the scrutiny of the probing of modern media that is more interested in what happens between the sheets of your bedroom than the rampant injustice that happens in the streets of American cities. Al Sharpton, thank you. You all do it all together, it's more persuasive. Al Sharpton may show up at every public civil rights fight, but that doesn't mean that Al Sharpton represents civil rights, nor Cornel West, who's brilliant. I don't know anything substantively of moral criticism of either Sharpton or West, but I guarantee you if you looked hard enough, you could find something. But then neither are Bill Cosby or Michael Brown to be dismissed because we know they did some things wrong. Or am I all alone in this room as someone who's made mistakes in my life? I've screwed up, and I still think you should give me some credibility in the things that I say. I don't always make mistakes. Are you wanting to volunteer something you've done wrong, Mel?
You told me I've made 2 mistakes since we're married.
2, just 2?
In 60 years.
60 years. I feel like you're going to tell us what those 2 mistakes were. Am I going to get a pass on these, Deb, or no?
I'm not mentioning them.
Okay, all right. But you see, now we're going to speculate. My point is, we have to stop letting the media do mudslinging to humiliate an individual and dismiss their message. The issue at play in Ferguson is institutional racism, not an individual who got shot. No, rioters should not burn down businesses or turn over police cars to avenge Michael Brown. But folks, racism is real. Wilson should not have shot Michael Brown. That, however, as sad as it is, was an individual event. And the righteousness or the wrongness of the public's anger cannot be judged based on whether or not the grand jury comes back with an indictment against Officer Wilson. The grand jury doesn't get to decide public morality. The racism that is motivating the demonstrations is real. Every life matters. Michael Brown's death is tragic and it's important. But the issue of state-sponsored racism did not begin or end with Michael Brown, any more than racism ended when we elected our first black president. Black men are disproportionately stopped by the police. They are 5 times more likely to be charged and jailed for the same offenses as a white person is. And in Springfield, Missouri, let a black man be driving a car with a white woman in the car, and you're almost guaranteed to be stopped. Students around MSU and interracial couples can give you story after story of how often they are pulled over simply because they're on an interracial date. But even the way the penal system is written discriminates against black people. Jail sentences for possessing crack cocaine have been, in some states, as much as 100 times more severe than possessing powder cocaine. And they're exactly the same drug. Crack cocaine and powder cocaine are exactly the same. The only difference being that crack is preferred in black neighborhoods and powder cocaine is more popular among members of our Congress and our Senate. You may think I'm exaggerating, but I will point out as just one example that the recent resignation of the Florida Representative Trey Riddell, he was arrested and found in possession of cocaine, and he had been one of the legislators sponsoring legislation to drug test all welfare and food stamp recipients. But I guarantee you that a higher percentage of members of Congress could be found to be using drugs than our food stamp recipients. In places where they have instituted drug testing for residents in public housing and recipients of food stamps, they've been shocked to find that the percentage of welfare recipients using drugs is much smaller than the average use among the rest of society. Why is that? Because they're poor. How hard could that be to understand? But if we were to couple drug testing of elected officials with drug testing of welfare clients, there would never be a bill passed because many members of Congress could not pass a drug screening. Al Sharpton, Bill Cosby, though condescending in their tone, were not wrong to counsel black young men not to try to make themselves look threatening and antisocial. Crime in the black community is not an imaginary problem. However, I could tell you how to cut crime in the black community by 90% by the end of 2015, and I'm not all that smart. We could cut crime, I'm going to claim by 90%, probably by more, by creating good-paying manufacturing jobs in the inner cities, by funding our urban schools at exactly the same level as our predominantly white private and suburban schools are funded, by decriminalizing drug addiction and by offering treatment for addiction rather than incarceration, and, if I may add, by instituting sane gun laws and by making health care universal. In the United States, we turned the war on poverty into a war on drugs, and that has become a war on the poor. It's primarily become a war on young black men. I don't like to use words like stupid in the pulpit. I think that's not very sophisticated. It doesn't sound like I've rubbed elbows with education. But this shift in public policy from the war on poverty to the war on drugs has been stupid, just stupid. Well, not entirely stupid. It's mostly been evil. Racism in the 21st century in America is a choice. It's a choice. An institutionalized, wicked, and inexcusable choice. And it's time for it to end. More than a decade before President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, a runaway slave, Frederick Douglass, was asked to deliver an Independence Day address in Rochester, New York. Perhaps next summer, I think, Sean helped me to remember, next summer when we come around to Independence Day, maybe we should just read the entire address as our message for that day, because it's really, really good. But I excerpted just a little bit of it as the wisdom lesson for our sermon today. But if I may summarize Douglass's speech, in the years before the Civil War, before it was certain that slavery was going to end in America, he reminded his white audience that the Independence Day that they were celebrating, in those days it was more often on the 5th of July than on the 4th, but it had been given to them, the independence they were celebrating, had been given to them by a generation of arguably brilliant geniuses who were largely very sophisticated, peaceful people who had gotten to the point that they'd had enough. They preferred peace, but they were moved to violence because of years of oppression. He said, "Oppression makes a wise man mad." Your fathers were wise men, and if they did not go mad, they became restive under this abuse. They felt themselves to constantly be victims of grievous wrongs, wholly incurable as a colony. With brave men, there is always a remedy for oppression. And the remedy, men and women, is often violent. There were those in those Revolutionary War days who were scandalized when we forcibly ejected Great Britain and their king and their government. There were people in the United States who just couldn't believe that we were rebelling against the established order. There were those who protested the Civil War. Some of the greatest anti-war protests that have ever happened on the American continent happened in response to the Civil War. People insisted that if we just gave it a little bit more time, if we just gave it some more time, that slavery would end itself. And admittedly, in every other industrialized nation in the world, slavery did end without a civil war. We're the only ones that had to have a civil war, but it would be difficult to argue that it could have been done otherwise. So I understand why anger among the black communities of our nation's major cities can go from the boiling point to the point of open flames. I do understand. As President Kennedy said, those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable. I don't want to be guilty of exaggerating for effect, although, you have to understand, the clergy largely have made a living through exaggeration. I don't want to give that up. But this point, being what it is, I don't want to exaggerate. I want to say this as literally as possible. You can quote me as meaning this absolutely literally. America is at a breaking point. The income disparity that is driving the middle class into poverty and making the burden of poverty unbearable is not sustainable. It cannot go on. The absence of jobs that pay a living wage and the inaccessibility of healthcare, transportation, housing, and education, so that a smaller and smaller slice of society can be obscenely wealthy, will push our once great nation to the point of violent revolution if we cannot intelligently correct our course. The news media on both the left and the right use fear and misinformation to keep a profit-generating audience. The Republicans and the Democrats both serve corporate interests, and both are guilty of wholesale deception of the voting public. In the real world, however, racism is real. Schools in poor neighborhoods are breeding grounds of ignorance, crime, and addiction, making them a pipeline into for-profit prisons. It isn't slavery, it's more subtle. But all of the abusive elements of slavery are present in the current system. 160 years ago, Frederick Douglass said, "It's not light that's needed now. We don't need more information, but fire. Not a gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, the earthquake. The feeling of the nation must be quickened. The conscience of the nation must be waken up. The propriety of the nation must be startled. The hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed. Its crimes against God and man have to be proclaimed and denounced." Men and women, I suspect that there are young black men in Ferguson who have turned over police cars and thrown Molotov cocktails at stores who, if we gave them the microphone here today, couldn't even tell you in words that make sense why they did what they did. They know they feel the rage, but they probably couldn't even tell you why. Just as, if you can catch the white extremist who burned down Flood Christian Church, I suspect that they would not be able to sensibly describe why they are so afraid of black people and why they give vent to such hatred and violence. We know that it wasn't the death of Michael Brown or the vilifying of Darren Wilson. Those are just the fuses on a social bomb that has been under construction for 200 years. A fury that was born in slave ships coming from Africa to the New World at the business end of whips on long-forgotten plantations. The rage comes from media that feeds a gullible public on subtle forms of racial fear and hatred that they disguise as entertainment. As Noam Chomsky has said, as long as the general population is passive, apathetic, diverted to consumerism or hatred of the vulnerable, then the powerful can do whatever they please. And those of us who survive will just be left to think about the consequences. So, my friends, it is not up to us to choose to be passive or apathetic, nor easily diverted by corporate media, nor led by our ignorant, racist friends into hatred of the vulnerable, because we must not let the powerful do as they please. We cannot stand idly by.
Amen.
You have been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at Rev. Dr. Ray at AOL.com for more information.